So you see the title of my speech, of my talk, and I describe myself as a naive physical climate scientist, as opposed to social scientists who are maybe a little bit less naive on political interfaces, right? But as a physical climate scientist, you will see it's difficult in the beginning, at least. Now I have to learn how to switch this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about physical IPCC working group 1 type climate science, but not too much. Just a few words. It's science that has been known for a long time, right? There's been constant progress over 200 years. You can't read every detail here. That's not important. What you see is it started like already in the 17th century with Halley, and there's lots of research going on over time, papers published with climate projections since the early 20th century or the late 19th century, actually. And with time, of course, climate change has unfolded as it has been projected. There are important papers like this one by 1967, Manabe and Wetherald, which you might know or not, but actually that person got the Physics Nobel Prize 2 years ago, right? Syukuro Manabe, for physical modeling of Earth's climate, quantifying variability and reliably predicting global warming. So the figure you see is one of the figures of his 1967 paper, where he did very simple simulations of temperature in the atmosphere. So the vertical axis is the atmosphere, cut through the atmosphere, vertical altitude, and the horizontal axis is temperature. And he had this very simple model where he calculated temperature in the atmosphere. You see the normal profile, the black curve. So it gets colder when you go into the mountains, and then you get the stratosphere where it gets warmer again. And one of these fundamental fingerprints of anthropogenic climate change through increased greenhouse effect is the fact that when you increase CO2 concentration, well, you get a warmer troposphere, which is the red curve, and a cooler stratosphere. So that was predicted 50 years ago, and that has been what is observed now, right? Other part of that Physics Nobel Prize is attributed to Klaus Hasselmann for his work on understanding variability and the work on statistical methods to attribute climate change. Attribution is the question, well, who did it, right? You often see that kind of figures to illustrate attribution. That comes from climate models. When you run a climate model without and with human forcings, greenhouse gases, aerosols, etc. In one case, you can simulate the observed curve, which is the black one. So the simulation is the red one, the observed one is the black one, and in the other case you don't. But the real methods of attribution are much more complicated, and because it's much more complicated, he got his Nobel Prize for that. And the idea for showing these two slides is basically, when you get a Physics Nobel Prize, it's really established science. You don't 2 years later come back and say, sorry, actually it's not wrong, it's not true. That doesn't happen. Okay, so that's an old science, but it does make progress. Slow progress, but it does make progress. What you see here is the estimates of equilibrium climate sensitivity. That is the magic number many of you probably know, which is the answer to the question, well, how much is global mean temperature going to increase if I double the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere at equilibrium? It would take some time, but the answer has been for a very long time actually, well, it's 3 degrees. You double CO2 concentration, after some time you will have 3 degrees warming. But it has been 3 degrees with a large uncertainty. And you see the uncertainty here on the graph. Do you see my mouse? Oh, you see the mouse. So Clement can see it also. Already in that first really important report, Bacharny report in 1979, the answer was 3, but it varies from 1.5 to 4.5. Now that is frustrating, right? It's a factor of 3. And here you see the different IPCC reports. First assessment, second, third, fourth, fifth. Same value, basically, around 3 degrees something, and the same uncertainty. In AR6, though, the report we published in 2021, we finally managed to reduce that uncertainty. It's still 3 degrees, still the same answer that we had 40 years ago, which is good, and the uncertainty is now saying it's between 2.5 and 4 degrees. So with 66% probability, we are between these two bounds, and with 90% probability between, what are the values, 2 and 5 degrees. So we have decreased that uncertainty by combining different lines of evidence, different types of proofs, if you want. So we're combining evidence here from process understanding, just understanding how the greenhouse gas and how the Earth works. From the instrumental record, we now have observations that are longer than they have been before, and of course we have this long increase from the 1970s to today, so which helps us better constrain the Earth's response to increasing greenhouse gases. More information from paleoclimates, and a technique that is called the emergent constraints, which I'm not going to explain in detail because it would take me at least 5 or 10 minutes. But anyway, so these combined evidence from different sources is really important in reducing that uncertainty. So we are happy. We've been banging our heads for 40 years against the wall, and now we finally made a hole in it. So if you look at the history of the attribution statements, again, attribution is a question, whose fault is it, right? Climate has been warming since the first report in 1990 with a rate of about 0.2 degrees per decade. And science has made progress, as I have at least I have tried to convince you. So the first assessment report in 1990 was very cautious because climate change was still weaker than today and science was not as evolved. So the attribution statement was the size of this warming is broadly consistent with predictions of climate models, but also some magnitude, also of the same magnitude as natural climate variability. So we didn't really know, or my predecessors didn't really know, whether you could attribute the climate change that was observed in 1990 to human influence. It could have been natural variability. And over time, over the years, it has become more and more certain. And in AR6, so in 2021, we can now state it as a statement of fact. We don't talk about probability. We talk about a fact. And factual statements are not that frequent in IPCC reports. Usually, you always have these high confidence, medium confidence, or very likely, unlikely, etc. This is a fact. There's no calibrated language here. They say it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. So it's a fact. We consider the human responsibility now as a fact. No question about it anymore. So within these reports, basically we've been saying more or less the same thing for 30 years with more certainty, but the concepts and the focus evolve. I'm focusing here on the Working Group 1 report. As you know, there's these 3 working groups in the IPCC. Working Group 1 is physical climate science. Working Group 2, where Wolfgang has been involved very heavily in, impacts and adaptation. And Working Group 3, the mitigation. Now, these evolve. We are now talking a lot about global warming levels. We are not talking about, well, we still talk about scenarios and the evolution of temperature on precipitation and whatever in time, but we also realize that whether we are on a pathway where warming is quick or on a pathway where warming is slow, if we place ourselves at the time where warming reaches, say, 2 degrees, actually there are many impacts and many variables in the climate system that are the same. It doesn't matter whether you're warming quickly or warming slowly. So, for example, the hottest state temperature change is a clear function of the global mean temperature change. The soil moisture change as a geographical distribution is the same depending in all scenarios if you are at the same temperature level. So for 2 degrees, you know, or for 4 degrees, you know that there are regions that are going to be wetter, going to be drier, and it's independent of the specific pathway. And that's very interesting information. Precipitation is also one of these fast variables that changes directly with the warming level you have reached. So you don't need to know which scenario you are on exactly. I've mentioned this before, IPCC doesn't come out of nothing. There have been reports before, like in 1965 already, 71, and the famous one, the Charney report in 79. These are very short reports, like 50 pages or even 30 pages. Now, working group reports in the IPCC are 3,000 pages long. So unreadable, basically. Important concept in these reports is, of course, the co-production. It's at the science policy interface. They are written on request and for the UNFCCC process. UNFCCC, United Nations Framework for Climate Change. No, United Nations Framework for Climate Change Convention. No, Convention on Climate Change. Anyway, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that is it. And so that is the convention that states sign, and they meet once per year for the famous COPs, right? So that's the thing where the COPs are taking place, and the IPCC writes the reports for the UNFCCC process to be effective, to have that information to take informed decisions. So there are, of course, numerous interactions with the governments because it is at the interface. The elections of the chair, of the working group co-chairs, of the IPCC, etc., that is done by the representatives of the different states that are members of the IPCC, 195. The scoping of a report, that is done as a co-process between the scientists and the representatives of the states who tell us what they want to see, what type of information they need to see in the report, the elections of the bureau, so the vice presidents of the IPCC and so on, and the reviews. There's a review process in many stages. There are 3 stages of reviews. It's done by experts, but also by the governments. And of course, the famous approval of the summaries for policymakers. And I'm going to talk about the approvals afterwards. But much of this interaction is actually quite opaque to most of the scientists who are involved in an IPCC report, for the simple reason that in a working group you have about 250, 300 scientists, and in the approval that not everybody goes to the approvals. It will be about 30 people or so from these scientists. So many just write that chapter, their specific part of the chapter detail where they provide detailed information on what they work on, basically, because they have been selected to write on what they know. And so many don't see these interactions with the political sphere. Now, talking more about the approvals. So the IPCC reports, if you talk about the working group report as such, the 3,000 pages, that is what is accepted. At some point, the delegates of the state say, okay, we accept that report, we have read it or not. But they accept it. It's not discussed in any detail at the approval. It has been reviewed by experts and governments, but it's not accepted, it's not discussed in detail at the approval session. Adopted is the case for the synthesis report, which is taking place at the end. After the 3 working group reports, there's a small synthesis report, which is written by 10 members of each working group. So Wolfgang has been writing that has been member of that synthesis report writing group in AR5, and I have been involved in the synthesis report of AR6. So we're only 30 people writing that small final product in the end. I have coordinated one section of the 3 sections of that report. So it's discussed page by page at the approval meeting, and they call it adopted. And the real important thing is the approval, which is the summaries for policymakers, which every report has, is discussed sentence by sentence, and they call it line by line, that's actually sentence by sentence. And it's every representative or every state has to be okay. So every thing has to be on consensus. So at the approvals, you have like 30 scientists or so from that working group or from the synthesis report, and the representatives of the different member states of the IPCC. You see the little flags of the member, the little signs of the member states here, and here's the podium. Full of scientists and full of, well, the president of IPCC is here, I'm here, and there's lots of other scientists. So, of course, you have 195 states, like 60 of them are there. There's a large variety of strategies at the approvals. If you are an island nation that is going to be submerged by the ocean, or if you are a petrol exporting country, you won't have the same strategy. Right? So, of course, they don't want to see the same thing in the reports, but in the end, every sentence has to be approved by each one of these countries. Now, you see, of course, you get these different strategies. Saudi Arabia, just to mention them, of course, will try to hide things, right? So these governments, many of them will neutralize each other. Long discussions in the end. In many cases, the SBM text gets substantially longer as a consequence of these processes, and we usually start with like 15 pages, and very often you end up with 30 pages of text, because that country wants this to be mentioned, and the other one wants this to be mentioned, and long discussions, 4 o'clock in the morning, it gets longer and longer. And that might be a deliberate strategy, because I will show that afterwards. And there's also because these discussions are so long, there's also a tendency to self-censor. When we as scientists know that if we write this, although it would be true, it's going to lead to very, very, very long discussion. It's not going to be accepted, or that kind of figure is not going to be accepted, because some countries will say, oh, only over my dead body, then we have to pick our fights, right? The approval is 1 week, and you have to be strategic on what you want to have in the report, and you can't win on every side. That's true. So there's things we have in the full reports that don't make it into the SPM, although as a scientist you would want it to see in the SPM, but all the countries have to agree. And there's this tendency to prefer to err on the side of least drama, as some people have put it. So, these long discussions at the SPM approvals lead to communication challenges, like you get monsters like that. That's one sentence of the SPM from Working Group 3. Global greenhouse gas emissions are projected to peak between 2020 and at the latest before 2025 in global model pathways, blah, 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 blah. It's called summary for policymakers. No policymaker will understand this thing, right? It's just unreadable. And that's a strategy too, right? If you want to hide things, if you can't make that sentence go away, make it unreadable, right? That's what happens. So these are the emission scenarios. And actually what happens is that in the Working Group 3, they have these integrated assessment models, economic, climate models, doing everything basically. And they have a time step for the output of 5 years. Now in these models, they had an output point in 2020, another one in 2025. Here's 2020, here's 2025. So in these scenarios that are compatible with 1.5 or 2 degrees, you have one point here in 2020, the next in 2025. The first point where the emissions decrease necessarily was in 2025 because you have a 5-year time step of your model. That's where it comes from. So it is true, and at the latest before 2025, that is strictly scientifically true because that comes from the output of the models. But it doesn't make any physical sense because if you want to keep warming below 1.5 degrees, we are basically today already at 1.15 or 1.2. If you want to keep warming below 1.5 or 2 degrees, you can't wait until 1st of January of 2025 to do so, to reduce the emissions, right? You have to do it immediately. Now, this has been accepted probably at 4 o'clock in the morning with everybody on his knees, sleeping and tired, and that leads to some communication challenges because when you write 2025, emissions have to decrease at the latest by 2025. In the media, that becomes utter nonsense. We have 3 years to avoid the end of the world, right? That is things you have read, but it comes from that sentence that is not understandable. One journalist writes 3 years left to avoid the worst, and then once this is out, it is almost impossible to stop a wrong message or a wrong understanding. So we wrote a tribune, as they call it in a French, big French newspaper. It's not too late to act, even if we go beyond 1.5, and we don't have to wait for 3 more years to take action. But anyway, it doesn't. Once it's out, you can't do anything anymore. A mantra that is really important is policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. Climatology is what some people call a post-normal science. Facts are uncertain, values are in dispute. Are you going to save the earth or keep our liberty? Stakes are high and decisions are urgent. So it's really an archetype of post-normal science. But there's even not uncertainty, there's even what we call deep uncertainty, when there is even substantial uncertainty about the uncertainty itself. When we're not even able to say 3 degrees plus or minus 1.5 degrees. When you don't even know how much the plus or minus is, then we call that deep uncertainty. And is that still policy relevant? Is that still policy relevant information when you say, well, it can't happen, but we don't know what the probability is, and we don't know what the uncertainty is. So that was hard to get into a summary for policymakers. And a good example for that is sea level rise, right? Ice sheet instability of the West Antarctic ice sheet in particular is something that we know that it might happen as a worst case scenario, but we are completely unable to say how likely it would be or how unlikely it would be. But we got it into our SPM, so you don't see all details in the figure, but the really important thing is here, this part, where we were able to put into the report sea level rise greater than 15 meters cannot be ruled out with high emissions. So in a case of very high emission, a very high emission scenario, which is not likely today, we cannot exclude the instability of the ice sheets, but we are not able to provide a probability. And that's what we call the low likelihood, high impact outcomes. And that's a concept that is really now much more present in the IPCC reports, and it is important. Island states are really keen on having that kind of information, saying it can be much worse than the likely range, the 66% chance range, right? So that's good. One last thing, climate wars. Climate deniers make me crazy, right? And of course, as a physical climate scientist, you're not prepared for that. You're not prepared to fight climate disinformations, for that dirty fight. And what I find personally interesting is that climate skeptics, deniers, very often attack what is really the most robust part of climate science. Because it's the most ancient part. Like the physical climate science is really the part that people have been working on most, and it's the easiest part. If you talk about impacts, there are so many different domains of impacts. Physical climate science is like a continent of knowledge with some ocean of ignorance around. In the impact science, it's a bit different. It's islands. Yeah, I'm going to finish. In the impact science, it's different. It's islands in an ocean of ignorance. And interestingly, the climate skeptics attack the most robust part. They are stupid, right? That's good. So these climate disinformation strategies are very well documented, but it's an asymmetric fight because we as scientists must stand true to the science. We can't just lie to make our point. We have to stick to the science. So that's asymmetric and frustrating. And that's the end, basically. After the most recent IPCC report, published in March 2023, so the synthesis report. It's based on the working group reports that have been published in 2021 and 2022, which had a literature cutoff date in 2020, typically, or 2021. So it's basically based on literature that is already old. As you know, when you write a paper, it also takes some time. So the data, the underlying data, come from 2019, 2020 at best. So 1 month after we have published the synthesis report, one paper has been coming out by IPCC authors updating the recent numbers, right? So basically, you write the synthesis report and it's already out of date. So that's one thought about the IPCC process. Really, really frustrating. So a very interesting paper. And of course, for much more up-to-date status, there's lots of websites from Met offices, space agencies, WMO, et cetera, with the latest temperatures. You probably have heard about the September temperatures this year, completely crazy. Antarctic sea ice extent. Finally, the Antarctic sea ice is also decreasing. That has been an anomaly because all other cryospheric components have been decreasing, like glaciers, ice sheets, Arctic sea ice, snow, permafrost, all has been decreasing except the Arctic sea ice. So it looks like the Arctic sea ice has already also started. And that's it. Thank you.